So in our second panel, I would very much like to introduce Ambassador Joachim Ruecker to come. It's an honor to see him again. He's been a great ally of the global civil society movement, focusing really to ensure that the Human Rights Council, in its last year before its 10th anniversary, remains focused on promoting and protecting human rights for the world's people. He's also an amazing individual that I've been able to meet over the years since we met in Berlin. He was a local statesman. I wouldn't call him a politician, a statesman with a global vision that focused on his constituents there, but has been recognized by his country and now is representing here Germany. But more importantly, you can really see in the last year the Human Rights Council focusing on human rights, and more importantly, thinking to the future of what will we look at in the third round of the UPR cycle, but also how the Human Rights Council still is open and accessible for civil society. So I'd like to welcome him here to be able to talk about the Human Rights Council and share his perspective from the podium, which is a unique place to sit and be able to see how we're looking at human rights around the planet.
Thank you very much, Joshua, and I would like to thank you and the organizers of this coalition of NGOs, and of course the Press Club for organizing this important event. I'm very happy to be here. We're now in the last month of my presidency, but there's still many things to do before the year ends. I think this is very pertinent, what you're discussing today. And in this framework, I would then comment on what you asked from me: leadership in addressing situations of human rights violations and making recommendations to realize fundamental freedoms. I would certainly like to also place the Human Rights Council in the developments in the last years, and because we've been talking about the MDGs, about the SDGs, I think it's important to reflect that the Human Rights Council is part of the Millennium Reforms, and I think we have seen progress in all three major areas, all three pillars of the United Nations. We've seen progress in the security and peace field. Maybe the most prominent progress is there, the concept of responsibility to protect. Less prominent is a reform of the Security Council, because we haven't seen it yet, but I think we should stay focused on that. With regard to development, prosperity, I think we have now we had the MDGs, we now have the SDGs, great progress. However, the proof of that pudding is in the eating, and we need to be very mindful of how we implement that, and that of course is an important exchange. And then we have the human rights field, where we have the Council since almost 10 years. The Council, as you all know, of course, is celebrating its 10th anniversary next year. And I think we can look back on the last 9 years with a degree of satisfaction. I think this Council has made a difference, especially if you compare it to the mechanisms, to the Human Rights Committee before. And it has, of course, this unique features. One of the unique features is the new instrument of the UPR, which I think is working well, but we have to focus on what we can now improve, lessons learned for the third cycle, very important. And the other wonderful and almost unique feature of us is, of course, the role of civil society. All of this I stress a lot when talking to the media, at the interface with the public, where I think the Council is underestimated, and the role as the main political forum for promoting and protecting human rights is not seen as it should be, because people focus on things, especially in the media sometimes, which the Council maybe is not able to deliver. I think what it is able to deliver is a public forum where we can discuss and exhibit violations of human rights. and thus create a political climate in which we can make progress. We don't have sanction instruments. That's of course something that the Council lacks. Only the Security Council has the possibility of sanctions. But if you look at the way we are using our mechanisms, I'm not talking about the UPR now mainly, but I'm talking about special procedures, our special rapporteurs, but also our commissions of inquiry. I think the weight they have in the global human rights, not only debate, but in progressing, if slowly at times, is underestimated. For example, our COI on Syria. This is the UN on the ground. If it wasn't for our Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry that really thoroughly talks to victims and to witnesses and wouldn't document all these grave violations of human rights and international humanitarian law as well, then there would be no mechanism to monitor what's going on, and then there would be no basis for subsequent accountability, because that's of course what it is all about. We need to create through our mechanisms accountability for human rights violations. The one thing is the political debate, exposing violations of human rights and making them accessible, and thus also influencing progress. The other thing is creating a basis for subsequent accountability. How can accountability work? Well, maybe one case in question we could look at, just another example is how we dealt with the COI results on North Korea, on the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Those results were very, very sobering, to say the least. We discussed them thoroughly at the Council. Of course, we're still discussing the reports of the Special Rapporteur on North Korea. Then they were passed on to the GA and to the Security Council, and the Security Council at least discussed the dimension of accountability, including passing this on to the International Criminal Court. I'm mentioning this because this is how our mechanisms can work, ideally, even if there is no sanctions like the Security Council has. With regard to the UPR, and I think you briefly touched upon that in your previous discussion, I think we have collected a lot of experiences now. The second cycle comes to an end next year, and before we enter into the third cycle, I think we have to discuss in the Council the pros and cons of the process, of the modalities, not the process as such, of the modalities. And I think what we have seen is a certain tendency, which we could call inflation in the recommendations. Countries getting hundreds of recommendations now, which look very similar. So I think there needs to be a certain clustering, merging, focus on, and maybe we need to change these modalities, up to member states, of course. And the other thing is that I think we need to focus even more on implementation, because recommendations is one thing, the implementation is another thing, and here the states really have a big responsibility to implement thoroughly and properly. And maybe we need to focus on this also more. Ideally, we have a good yardstick. It's actually very hard to have yardsticks for progress in human rights. But I think with the UPR process, we do have a yardstick, because we can compare the recommendations and their implementation, but especially the recommendations from the first cycle to the recommendations from the second cycle. And then, of course, we see that there's progress, and there's a number of countries that have, do not have the recommendations from the first cycle anymore, because they have implemented what was recommended, and then it doesn't appear again in the second cycle. For example, there's a number of countries that have abolished death penalty, or that have issued moratoriums on the death penalty. And you see that clearly between the first and the second side, so you have this yardstick. But I think the countries need to focus even more on proper implementation, maybe look at the reporting mechanisms, that they are more stringent, maybe even more standardized. And this is of course the very big asset we have, we need to rely even more on civil society for mirroring and speaking the truth about what's happening on the ground. And this is the one thing that I kept repeating during the year, and I will continue to repeat, that in the Human Rights Council we have seen over the last years that civil society is not something that is somewhat added value or nice to have. It is absolutely core to what we do. If we don't have civil society and the media to monitor what we have actually done in the way of coming to resolutions or deciding on resolutions, or what our mechanisms are saying, or what the UPR is imposing on states, then I think we will not succeed. So we need you, we need the civil society, we need the media to give us this mirror, this reality check. And that's something that I think is increasingly seen by member states, and of course the whole UN membership, despite the fact that of course we have also seen during this year increased pressure on civil society, and we've seen, and I'm sad to say, I have also had a number of reports, again at every council session and in between, of reprisals against civil society. And just to be complete, I'm following up on each and every case of alleged reprisals that comes to my attention, and that has to do with people interacting or trying to interact with the Human Rights Council or its mechanisms. I think it's also very important to stress the role of the High Commissioner, totally different mandate. But I think it's important to stress that if the human rights pillar is to keep its impact on really changing people's lives and making progress, I think we need an independent High Commissioner that is able to pick up every subject in this case he wants to, and he must address and speak out on all human rights issues. And we have during this year introduced a new format of interacting with the High Commissioner. I think it's not enough if he addresses the Council during regular sessions, but we have now a format where he can also address the Council in an informal briefing between the sessions, because one thing we of course are obliged to do from our founding resolutions and from common sense is that we have to be responsive to acute crises, and we cannot wait until we have a regular session. So we have instruments like the informal dialogue with the High Commissioner on urgent cases. We have instruments like special sessions, which we use at times. Right now people are talking about a special session on the case of Burundi. I'm not sure whether it will materialize, but there is a good chance it will materialize in the next couple of days, etc. Maybe one other aspect I would like to cover is sort of the overarching topics which I have tried to address this year. Actually there were four. One I have mentioned already: strengthening and protecting the space for civil society, and being clear when it comes to reprisals. And there's three more I have tried to address during the year. One is the institutional relationship, or the relationship of the Human Rights Council with the rest of the UN world, in particular of course the Geneva-New York relationship. And this has several aspects. It has an institutional aspect because legally speaking the Human Rights Council is a subsidiary of the GA, and that sometimes leads to problems, as in 2013 where we had a train wreck where a very important resolution of the Human Rights Council was actually stopped, if you so wish, by the GA. There's also financial issues when it comes to the Geneva-New York relationship. So that's one thing I try to focus on during the year. The other thing is I was trying to deal with efficiency together with the Council, because we have this inflation in our agenda. We're suffering from our own success, whether it's initiatives in general, whether it's resolutions, whether it's panels, whether it's special mechanisms, special procedures, whether it's side events. You know, the number is skyrocketing, and it's an exponential growth every year. So we have to actually deal with the issue of efficiency. And also I think it's important to stress that we shouldn't be sidetracked. We shouldn't be sidetracked with things that are maybe less important. Now it's of course very, very difficult also to always keep the right balance between thematic issues, which are important, and country-specific issues, which are also important. Some countries are of the opinion we shouldn't deal with countries, especially under item 4 at all. Item 10 is a different story, but item 4, I don't share that, but we have that opinion, so there is a certain pressure to alter that proportion in the sense that we talk more and more about thematic issues and less about country, but that cannot be the right direction. So we have issues in the Council that are connected with efficiency, but are also ultimately political. And the third and last thing, or the last thing I want to mention, is effectiveness, because there is no efficiency for efficiency's sake. I think the Council has to strive to improve further its effectiveness. What does that mean? We have to monitor, with your help, how the soft law resolutions, because that's what they are, soft law, politically binding but not legally binding, how are they implemented in the countries? How is it implemented which is the case in the overwhelming majority of our resolutions, when we call upon states to do something, either states in general or particular states? How do they deal with that? And you help us, please, to monitor whether states are paying attention to these soft law obligations. And also effectiveness, of course, is the whole debate I've just touched upon already. You know, what do we do with the UPR? How can we improve the UPR before we enter into the third cycle? Maybe, Josh, with your approval, I will stop here and we can enter into Q&A. Yeah.
So I'd like to thank Ambassador Ruecker, and I think you've raised some very important points that we can think of. As you know, many of you were involved with the Universal Periodic Review of Laos, and others were involved in the other countries where you live as well, looking at Canada, US, and Australia. And we do see in the second cycle, there is a repeat of a lot of different recommendations where maybe we could almost come up with a number, where, you know, instead of when you have the countries like the United States, where there's so many people asking questions and making recommendations, where you have 122 countries wanting to speak. Maybe, you know, the Council could have a list of numbers of, number 1 is ratification of instruments, number 2 is maybe International Criminal Court, 3 is death penalty, or different ones, and they could just say, we recommend 1, 7, 8, and then they could still make a new recommendation, maybe that other countries haven't said. So there's a lot of innovation that I think we can still build on, and I do think if you look at what your goals were of being responsive, but also being effective and increasing efficiency, that's definitely been underway, and you've built a strong foundation for the second decade of the work of the UN Human Rights Council. We'll open it up to a couple of questions, and we also have a surprise in that we also have a traditional Laos dance troupe to conclude after your panel as well.
Do I have to dance?
You don't have to. We can, though, together if you want to.
Thank you, Ambassador Ruecker, for being here with us, your generosity, and you try to find a way to come and meet with us in your busy schedule. Sorry to hear that this month is your last presidency, serving in the council, and I guess if you do not run again, we will lose our good friend in here. Yeah, we are very impressed. We came from Laos, and we were the victim of the government, bad government. And last year in January, Lao PDR was summoned to the UPR reporting. They go home with the 96 recommendation from UPR. And after that, there is a contract, I would say the contract, a recommendation, and they need to come back and report in 6 months, for which they come back in June. And they half-heart and halfway accept the recommendation. I think it's about 80, over 80 recommendation. They say that they can implement it, but as so far as we know, all of those things have to go through the Lao Parliament, but they didn't do anything yet. To us, we don't speak for ourselves here, we speak for our compatriot, to 8 million Lao people. It's living constantly under the oppression, under the dictatorship now. I don't want to go to that part. But as a country member, Lao PDR have an obligation since Lao is a member of the Human Rights Council. And what do we do on that? Once they go home, they come back and with all kind of answer and a game, and they try to push that off. They don't want to change. And is there any, if you will, can you, as a citizen, as an NGO or civil society, can do more? And you mentioned on your speech that maybe the media and also as a regular citizen like us can help. In Laos, circumstance is different. Anybody tries to speak up against the government will be abruptly as the end of the sentence. It's very dangerous, what I'm saying. The Lao people, it's suffering for 40 years. Lao is a small country, but 8 million people is suffering. I think they are equally deserve some type of treatment from the world community to help them. That's why we are there. Any recommendation from your part, to have an insight, comment on that part, on that question that we have. We all have the same question.
You want to take a couple questions, or is that's a good start?
It's a start, but maybe then we can go to like groups of questions.
Sure, sure.
But you seem a bit hesitant because I think the question is how can you make sure that states meet their obligation?
Yes, sir.
I think there's no other way than if obligations are not met, then creating a public forum worldwide and addressing shortcomings through media and through civil society, and that's exactly what we're doing. I think there is no other way.
Perfect. And that's why we're meeting on this historic day too. It's the anniversary of when things started to go in the wrong direction in Laos as well. Are there any other questions? Yes, in the front row.
Yes, I have a question, brief question. You have spoke briefly on reprisal and the protection of the NGOs. We are the NGO, for example, my colleagues and I are, in fact, we are on the blacklist of Lao PDR. None of us is unable to enter to Laos. If we enter, we are fearful of our lives. So what is the specific mechanism or what kind of the protection that you have to protect us, the NGOs? So in order for us to do a better job, for example, we need to enter the country to actually do the field work instead of get the information, the secondary information that's provided by colleagues within. So we actually want to gain the access to, in this case, is Laos. Can you elaborate on that? Thank you.
I'll take the another question as well. Is there one more question? Anyone? Okay. So I think it's a very important question. It's also part of the important work and leadership of Ambassador Ruecker was looking at the issue of reprisals and working with civil society when people would come to participate in the council or at the UPR when they returned home. So it's related to what you've already been working on, but we'd like to...
Yeah, I mean, when you as an NGO have a problem being blacklisted, as you say, or entering country, then I think this can be part of a political debate that you're leading yourselves, and that will find its way in the media. Why is it that Group X is not allowed in country Y, and why is it that they cannot enter? However, if what you're doing is related to the work of the Human Rights Council, for example, you want to interact with our special rapporteurs, thematic or country-specific, or if you want to interact as an NGO that wants to speak in the council, then we can make this an issue of the council, presidency at least, that then we would need a written complaint by you, and then we could say this is about interacting with the UN mechanism, because that's also important for the Secretary General in New York. Whenever you want to interact with the UN mechanism and you are impeded from doing so, then I think this becomes an issue for the UN. In this case, the Human Rights Council, so you want to interact with us, but somebody stops you from interacting, then we can take this up and, e.g., talk to the government concerns, whatever the government concern is, of a country, and say, why is this that the NGO X cannot speak in the council, cannot enter the country for collecting data or whatever. That doesn't mean it's automatically successful when it's an issue of the council, but or for the presidency. But it can only become one if it's about interacting with us and our mechanism.
Thank you.
Are there any other questions? We're doing okay with time, or we have a couple of minutes more, so anyone else would have a question for the council president? The floor is open. One more from my... Sure.
I hope I don't talk, speak. I like to share a story, a recent, well-known story about one of the well-known person in Laos. You may know, have known of him. His name is Sombat Somport. Last March, we met with his wife, Ming Shui, in Tokyo. She have a personal, tragic, and very sad story to share with us, and I like to bring this. It's very touching for me. Since the disappearance of her husband, Sombat Somport is very well known in Laos. He have a lot of friends, the neighborhood, living together, they all live in harmony. After his disappearance, and his wife start to raise concern with the world community. Almost 3 years now, his neighbor, her neighbor, they used to be good friend or close friend. They slowly start to distance themselves from talking and engaging with his wife, as she knows. It's very sad. Every day she's crying, every night she cries in the dark of the night, expecting her husband to come back, and she does not know where he is. The people, his neighbor, the neighbor that is distanced from her is because the retaliation that has been the fearful, the safety. If the neighbor continue to meet to talk to his wife, and think that they feel threatened by just having that contact. In this sense, I bring this up to let you know, to share with you that this is how the people in Laos is living under the fearful constant fear all the time. And the government, Lao PDR, it's very good on that. They are the member of the human rights, but they sign the contract, they get every help to improve the law in the country, to respect the human rights law. On the other hand, they don't do that. They just tumbling their hand the nose of the world international community, and that is something that I think the world need to know, and I think as the chairman of this very important organization should know the real life. We are not asking for any specific treatment to dethrone the Lao government, but I just ask them to respect, to treat people right. That's all we want to talk.
Very well, thanks for sharing. There's a question.
Yes. Yes. Good morning. We are talking a lot of human rights, in Laos. Talk a lot about that. Everyone know about that. Today we're talking about human rights too. But my question is, the Lao government, including regime, take anything they want to take. They take the daughter, they take Laotian land, take everything they want. The UN will be take exemption sometime, or thank you. Understand my question?
Yeah.
Yeah, the general thrust of it. I think.
I make sure you understand,
Yeah. I hope your daughter was never taken.
I, of course, can relate very much to your question because it's asked a lot. The question is, what will the UN do in cases of problems, violations of human rights? And we do have the situation that the UN is, and that applies to the Human Rights Council as well, is of course, by its composition, not more, not less, but what the name says, the United Nations. So they're all together. And in order to pass resolutions, to condemn situations, to take measures, they need majorities, political majorities. And sometimes, it's sad to say, in cases where you think there should be something done, it's just not possible to achieve a majority. Whether it's in the GA, whether it's in the Security Council, whether it's in the Human Rights Council. Since the UN is not more, but also not less than the United Nations sitting together and trying to agree on something, or vote on something, and at least have a majority if they don't agree, there is no other way than building coalitions to get where you want to be. Sometimes these coalitions are hard to forge. Sometimes it's a stony path, but sometimes you also succeed. For example, we have just had the case of Sri Lanka in our September session, and you know that there was a report by the High Commissioner that the Human Rights Council had asked for, and that took into account everything that happened and tried to show a way for a truth and reconciliation process, because that's what's needed in all those countries that had a very violent past of war and civil war in that case. I think there's no other way than through a truth and reconciliation process to overcome internal divisions and also have accountability with regard to people, to culprits, to perpetrators. And I think we, for example, in the case of Sri Lanka, discussed a lot whether one should have a majority vote, saying this is the resolution, and even if some people disagree, the majority would decide this is the, let's say, harsh measures which need to be taken on the path which needs to be taken in Sri Lanka. then there were others that said, let's take Sri Lanka on board, especially with the new president, new government, which is open to the truth and reconciliation process more than the others were before. And why don't we try to have a consensual resolution? Because then you usually succeed really in implementation much better than if you have a majority vote. So I guess what I'm saying, to get to a majority is one thing, and it's a challenge if you want something to be stopped. But sometimes it's even better to reach a consensus and have the country concerned on board rather than opposing this and saying, yeah, I hear that you decide this by majority, but I'm not on board because I don't think this is right. So sometimes you're not even there with the majority vote. I know this doesn't sound maybe too good for you, but this is how the reality is in the UN.
Thank you very much. I think what's important is he's really actually in a way laying out a recipe for what needs to be done to build a movement. It's one thing to protest, it's one thing to raise the issues. The other is to build the political capital with other countries in the region to show how it's in their interest as well to make sure that Laos promotes and protects human rights. So it's a real formula of what other groups have done that have been in the same situation and are now seeing significant changes inside their country. I think when many of you discuss this issue, we could look at it in the context of Myanmar, that many people couldn't work in Myanmar. I know I was not able to visit inside Myanmar for a long time. And in the last 2 years, we've done diplomacy trainings and human rights trainings inside the capital and throughout the country. So I think it's taking a long-term approach, which is also what we're looking at today, looking at the 70th anniversary of the UN and looking at the anniversary next week of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's what we need to do in the future and how we can be effective at the UN Human Rights Council, but also through the UPR in the upcoming cycle. So I definitely like to thank you for your response. And if we have no other questions, it depends. We have one more? Okay.
Yes, I have a short question. Earlier in January, we have to side event the part of the issues. As you know, 1975, the communist government took over the government and have sent many thousands from the royal family all the way down to ordinary citizens and young men and women of Laos to concentration camp or seminar. And many have perished. And we wanted the issues about part of the recommendation, but none of the member states made it into the recommendation. For example, we just want that we want to ask the Lao Pidar and where are the remaining of our royal family members from Prince and Crown Prince and many others of the government officials in that time. So that's why, but it wasn't any in the part of the recommendation. How can it make it so to be part of our request, or we want it to be part of the recommendation? Is there any way of revisit that?
Well, systemically, I'm surprised if something that is so important to you is not in the recommendations, because that's what you have to do. You have to talk to states that are actually active in the UPR process, which is member states or deliver states, and you should, if you have something that you think should be in the recommendations, there's ways and means to approach states to raise it. And of course, civil society can also raise it when the OHCR does their report and listens to civil society.
Okay, so I'd like to wrap up then our second panel, and it also is a small break because we didn't do a break when you started, it was just going straight away. But we also have now a cultural dance that will be performed by the traditional Laos Dance Company.
Great, thank you.